presentation. I'm so delighted to be here. I've been in this room several times. And just a quick survey. I know I can't survey the folks on Zoom. I'd like to welcome you as well. How many of you are master naturalists? Raise your hand. How many of you are master gardeners? How many are members of the Native Plant Society? Okay, well, I know there are lots of other groups covered, but I'd like to welcome all of you. When I started looking at invasive plants back in 2007, my son was 15 at the time. And he said, "Mom, when are you going to be finished eradicating plants, invasive plants?" And I said, "Well, I'll probably be doing this for the rest of my life." And that was 15 years ago. And I still have the same passion for native plants and invasive plants that I had back then. And what gives me the energy to continue are people like you who joined me in Bandera. Raise your hand if you came to Bandera. Who joined me in Bernie. Raise your hand if you came to Bernie. Okay, raise your hand if you've done any invasive removal in any park, preserve, or your backyard. Okay, so we've got almost a unanimous participation. So here's the situation. There are several books written about invasive plants. My goal is, and you all know quite a bit already, my goal is to share something about each of those top 12 hill country invasive plants that are the most problematic. And I had a wonderful conversation with a gentleman before this meeting started. He's at Tierra Linda. And he was asking me, how do I prioritize? How do I choose which plants are most important? And the top 12 list that you all should have, if you don't raise your hand, we can pass them out. The top 12 is where you start, because there are 144 invasive plants listed on the Texas Invasive site. And we can't tackle all of them, but we have to tackle the ones that are the most problematic. So let's just jump in. I'm going to move pretty quickly. I have a lot of photos. Particularly since we're doing this on Zoom as well, I have fewer words and more photos. So those of you at home, if you leave the room, you're going to miss a bunch of stuff. So stay there, stay with me, and we'll go ahead with the program. On a global basis, the two great destroyers of biodiversity are first, habitat destruction, and second, invasion by exotic species. E.O. Wilson, famous Harvard ecologist. He's deceased, but boy, did he hit the nail on the head. There are many ways to destroy habitat and reverse biodiversity. We know habitat destruction by urban sprawl. We know habitat destruction by urbanization. Habitat destruction by overgrazing. I just came back from West Texas, from Alpine. If anybody who's spent any time in West Texas, we know the issue. Habitat destruction by agricultural monoculture. All those cornfields, soybean fields. This is a little controversial, folks, but habitat destruction by a traditional lawn. The more we learn about our traditional lawns, and I'm the first to say that that's what I had in my yard for several years. The thing about it, it's just as much a monoculture as any of those other slides. Habitat destruction by invasive plants. Okay, let's look at the formal definition, because people often ask me, well, I've got this plant in my yard and it's acting in an aggressive or invasive manner. Well, there are lots of plants that can get out of control, but there is an official definition. And that official definition is, an invasive species is defined as a species that is non-native to the ecosystem and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So those are the three criteria that we look at when we're trying to decide what to do about these invasive plants. How bad is it? 50,000 species of plants have been introduced in the United States, starting with Thomas Jefferson. He was the one that wanted a little bit of everything from all over the world. About 5,000 of these introduced plants have escaped cultivation into the wild. And here's a clincher. We know we're in a significant time frame in terms of species loss. 42% of endangered or threatened species in the US are at risk from invasive species. We know now that invasive plant infestations in the US equal an area the size of Texas, and that's growing every single day. We know that it costs the US economy $135 billion annually, and I guarantee you that number does not include the labor of every single person in this room and every single volunteer in the country who's out pulling and eradicating invasives. What makes a plant invasive? Rapid vegetative growth. We have giant reed here. It grows 12 inches a day. We have Johnson grass with the rhizomes that are can spread 200 feet from the original plant. We know the Chinese tallow tree and the tree of heaven exude allelopathic chemicals, which prevent other plants from germinating, growing, surviving, and reproducing. So they release nasty chemicals into the soil, which helps them gain an unfair advantage. We also know that many of these invasive plants are prolific seed producers. So when I was speaking with the gentleman here at Tierra Linda, he has lilac chase tree down by the riparian habitat. And my recommendation to him was you go after that one first, because it's going to reproduce to the tune of 350,000 seeds per year, starting from the time it's a foot tall. So we need to go after the big ones. The golden rain tree is on your list. And that one, the problem there is the germination is so quick that the minute the seed hits the ground, we've got a new plant going. Why did they become invasive? Number one, it's because there's been some kind of disturbance. So it may be human caused, it may be nature caused. You know, we live in flash flood alley. So every single time we have one of those flash floods, everything upstream moves downstream. Things spread out, go right and left. And every time that happens, our invasive plants have yet another advantage. We know that they have a lack of natural controls. I was just at the NPSOT conference in Alpine this weekend where we discussed salt cedar, we discussed arundo, lots of the West Texas plants. I didn't know this, but I just learned that in its home country, salt cedar has 350 insects that eat it. In the United States, salt cedar has almost none except for the ones that we have introduced as biological controls. So if I'm a plant that comes over from China, Japan, the Mediterranean, South Africa, nothing's going to eat me. Nothing's going to cause me disease. Those insects, those pathogens, those diseases are where I came from. They're not here. So that gives me a huge advantage. We also know that they have a lack of competitors that normally regulate their population. How do they cause harm? The reason I put this picture in here is that Arundo donax, giant reed, which is one we're going to talk about today, has many problems. The first is that it alters the river in huge ways. In the old days, you had the Rio Grande flooding across a broad, basically a broad floodplain, and that was true for many of our rivers. But as soon as we have these invasive plants that basically take over and form monocultures along the river, now we have a channel. And we know that when we have a channel, the water moves that much more quickly. It scours the ecosystem, and it becomes, it basically alters the entire structure of the riparian habitat. We also know that a plant like arundo is highly flammable. It ignites easily. I saw some arundo in the ditch on the way in today, and I'm sure that everybody here has seen some arundo either close up or from a distance. Arundo is so flammable that they were considering using it as a fuel, as a biofuel. But I will tell you that if it catches on fire in a riparian habitat, we are going to lose control of that habitat. Let's look at how they cause harm. They create monocultures. We have a ligustrum monoculture. How many of you have seen a ligustrum canopy? Shades out everything underneath. Okay, what about, there's giant reed again. Every single little pixel there is a reed. We're talking about 300, 400, 500 miles of arundo and salt cedar along the Rio Grande. They also cause harm because they reduce biodiversity. And the reason they reduce biodiversity is nothing can eat them. They destroy the food chain. They also cause harm because many of these plants are toxic. Anybody here a rancher that has had an experience with Johnson grass on their ranch? Johnson grass can kill cattle during certain conditions like a frost or new growth after an extended drought. And I'm talking about drop dead experiences. Sheep, cattle, horses. A horse can die from 3 China berries. I was at a dude ranch up in Bandera a few months ago, and in the pen where they kept all the horses to ride were 5 mother China berry trees. Now, by mother trees, I mean they're 3 to 4 feet in diameter. And I said to the wrangler there, have you ever had any deaths from these berries? And she said, no. And I said, well, you will if you don't remove them. 3 to 4 China berries can kill a horse. We know that young children, anybody have grandchildren, toddlers, neighbors with small children, they love little red berries. They love Nandina berries. They love the grapes. They look like grapes on the ligustrum. We have toddler poisonings every single year, primarily children under the age of 4. We know that dogs can die from ingesting these plants. I was doing a workshop last week. A woman came up. She said that she works at a nursery, and a woman came up to her at the nursery and said, why are you still selling ligustrum? My dog just died from eating ligustrum berries. So these are serious issues. And the more we know about it, the more we realize that we can't just do nothing. We do need to act in a responsible and cohesive and coordinated manner. Okay, I believe my assistant here is going to walk around with a couple of things, a bowl of beautiful looking fruit and a wonderful little plant. And there's something you're going to notice about that as she walks around. And the fact is they're fake. So even if they look delicious and they look like you might want to eat them, you can't. They're inedible. And what we know is that invasive plants for many of our wildlife are basically junk food or toxic. So how did they get here? On purpose or good intentions? By the horticulture industry for ornamental purposes. By government agencies. We brought in Clayburgh, bluestem. We brought in KR bluestem. We brought in arundo for erosion control. We brought in lots and lots of these plants for shade, for all kinds of reasons, which we didn't know at the time would become problematic. Again, how did they arrive? Contaminated seed mixes or hay. The boots and clothing of hikers, farmers, and ranchers. How many of you hike? How many of you go to preserves and parks? And when you come back, oftentimes you've got seeds on your clothing. You've got seeds in your boots. So we all inadvertently can also pass this along. We know that every time in Texas we have a flood event, we've got seeds dispersed up and down the watershed. We know that people will release aquatic plants from their aquariums. And we know that oftentimes plants like giant savinia, water hyacinth, some of our aquatic invaders will hitchhike to another location. One of the worst right now is zebra mussels. How many of you heard about zebra mussels? Talking about billions of dollars of potential damage because of a tiny little mussel that started in one lake in Texas and is on its way to every lake. We also know that, of course, birds, animals, and humans disperse the seeds, but when you're an invasive plant and you have no predators, nothing that's going to take you down, everything helps you. Escape from yards, gardens, and arboretums. We're not going to talk about bamboo here, but I call it damboo because I had it in my yard and we tried everything. We don't use chemicals in our yard. because we have a small enough yard that we can manage without chemicals. But I tried cutting. I cut again. Finally, I got a mattock and basically dug it out by the roots, put those roots in a contractor bag and sent them to the dump, so that they could be buried 6 feet under. Something like bamboo is a never ending challenge. Okay, let's talk about the dirty dozen. You all have a list right there. Each of these plants has a number of factors that make them particularly harmful. Each one of you is going to have a different motivation or reason for wanting to get rid of it, but I'll touch on some of the most critical pieces of each of these. And again, we've got some assistants that are going to walk around with some plant samples. I actually have I have 10 of the 12 samples with me. And if you really want to get a good look afterward, come on up. They'll be up here after the program. Okay, first of all, we're in Ecoregion 7. You all know that as Master Naturalists. We're in the Edwards Plateau. Okay, ligustrum. We have in this area, we have ligustrum, Japanese ligustrum, and we have ligustrum lucidum. I have to tell you, in Texas, there are 5 ligustrums that are problematic. There is no such thing as a good ligustrum in Texas. So keep that in mind. If somebody tries to tell you at the nursery that this one is non-invasive or this is not a problem, do not believe them. There is no such thing as a good ligustrum in Texas. There's the ligustrum canopy again, shades out everything below it. Okay, we know it colonizes by root sprouts and by the seeds that you see in those purple drupes. Here's something new about ligustrum that they're discovering. Ligustrum acts as basically the thickets of ligustrum act as a ladder fuel. If there's a wildfire, then it goes to the top, to the crowns, and becomes a really out of control hot fire. So it's not, it ends up being exponentially more dangerous because it acts as a ladder to the top of those trees. And you know what? In Texas, we're having more and more wildfires. We probably will have more and more wildfires. All the more reason to let ligustrum go. We know that the chemicals in the leaves inhibit digestion for insects, and they're exceedingly fast growing. We also know, anybody here suffer from allergies? I'm not talking about mountain cedar, but other allergies. Okay, so we know that ligustrum releases pollen that causes a lot of problems for humans and for pets. We know that it thrives in woodlands, riparian habitats, and forest margins. We know that animals and humans can have intestinal distress or worse from eating the berries, and contact with berries or leaves can cause dermatitis or eye irritation. No such thing as a good ligustrum. Chinese tallow. How many of you have been to Houston lately? So what happens down there is you have floodwaters that remain in one location for several months. And the problem is that the tallow seeds float in addition to being eaten by seeds. The problem is that they take over, they form monocultures. When I first started this work in 2007, approximately 1 out of every 5 tree in the Houston area, the greater Houston area, was a Chinese tallow. We've had several hurricanes and flood events since then. Now, we know that, let's go all the way here. Tallows now account for 33% of the trees in Houston area public urban spaces, with an annual increase of 38% per year in the public forests. This is called, they call it terrible tallow. The good news, it's on the list, the noxious weeds list, which means that nurseries may no longer sell Chinese tallow. Going back again, let's see if it'll go back. Beginning in the 3rd year, the tallow tree produces 100,000 seeds and can continue that rate for 100 years. So this is a long living tree. It takes over, it spreads by multiple ways, and it grows 3 times faster than hardwood. Wrong direction. Another thing that just came to my attention is that 60% of the lumber in this country comes from the southern forests. And these tallow trees are invading that area to the point where we have significant revenue reductions because tallow is taking over our plantations and our forests. It also releases a chemical compound that inhibits growth. No such thing as a good tallow. Johnson grass. We have a wonderful specimen here. It's in full bloom right now. Raise your hand if you know Johnson grass. Okay. If you have it in a small property, just yank it out by the roots. If you have it in a large property, not much you can do. Johnson grass is one of the top 10 most invasive plants in the world. It also has viable seeds that last for 20 years. It's highly aggressive. It has rhizomes that will travel 200 feet. It can be fatal to sheep, goats, horses, and cattle under certain conditions. We also know that the pollen of the Johnson grass is also a known allergen for people with allergies and asthma, and it causes hotter and faster fires. Nandina. This is a point in the program where I always turn my back and I ask if people to raise their hand if they have a Nandina in their yard. Some people do, some people don't. Most people have gotten rid of them, but a lot of people still have them in their yard. So let's talk about Nandina. It displaces native species. It escapes cultivation. It spreads easily through root sprouts and through the seeds. But the most important thing about Nandina to know is that the berries contain cyanide, and flocks of particularly berry-loving birds in the winter have died from eating the berries. We also know that the berries are toxic to cats, dogs, grazing animals, and children. So that beautiful evergreen plant that has the beautiful red berries in the winter has to go. This is a graphic screen. These are the cedar waxwings that they discovered in a massive die-off in Georgia in 2008. Up to that time, they had had previous die-offs, but they didn't know what caused it. So they did the examination at the veterinarian school, and they discovered that these birds hemorrhaged to death from Nandina berries that basically contain cyanide. So I had a friend who was in San Antonio who was feeding her birds to the tune of $300, $400, $500, $600 a month. And she had a whole row of Nandina berries. And I kept asking her, would you at least cut off the berries? You know, in the spring it has a white bloom. And if you can clip that, then at least you can have the evergreen. But of course, she never got around to it, didn't get around to it. The day that I heard about this study, I sent her these images. And she said, got it, gone. She did not want to attract the birds to her yard so that she could kill them with cyanide, hemorrhaging to death. Okay, here's another very important concept, very important principle. If you leave this room today with nothing else, I want you to think about the exponential function. So if we have one Nandina that produces berries, we have 3 years later, 6 Nandinas that produce berries. Those berries produce berries. Within 5 to 6 to 7 years, you have thousands and thousands of Nandina plants. So we've discovered when we look at the exponential function, if we kill that Nandina in year 1, we're basically cutting down on the future supply of trees, future supply of plants. I have a friend who has a Chinese tallow in his yard. He's a member of Native Plant Society. He's a highly intelligent person. He said, my tallow doesn't spread. And what I've tried for 10 years to talk him out of, to ask him to get this tree down. But basically, yes, his tree produces 100,000 seeds per year the entire time that he has it in his yard. Okay, we have something called the invasion curve. And if you look to your left, you'll see that at the beginning, in fact, the gentleman, the Tierra Linda, I hate to keep picking on you, but he basically said, I found this, this, and this. He's doing an initial evaluation of his property to see what's there, to discover what's there. He's at the prevention section. His next goal then is to eradicate those plants that are problematic. That's stage 2. The next one is if one of those plants or more of those plants become problematic, then he'll be lucky if he can contain them. And if it goes beyond that, then basically you have a lifetime challenge. So we have a lifetime challenge with KR bluestem, with Johnson grass, with Arundo donax, with tallow, with Chinaberry. But we better by God try, because it really makes a difference to everything else in the ecosystem. Let's talk about Chinaberry tree. Most of you have seen those yellow berries in the wintertime hanging from the trees. It can grow 5 to 10 feet per year. Lots of ways for it to reproduce. It actually repels insects. In China, they use it as an insecticide. The fruits are poisonous to humans, dogs, cats, and livestock. I talked about the horses. It outcompetes the native plants, and it releases chemicals into the soil. By the way, Chinaberry is also on the state noxious weeds list, which means you can no longer buy it in the nurseries. Japanese honeysuckle. I don't have a sample here today, but most of you have heard about kudzu, the vine that ate the South. Well, in fact, Japanese honeysuckle is more problematic than kudzu. So if you find a little patch of Japanese honeysuckle in your yard or in a preserve or in a park, get it now, because otherwise you're in a situation where it spreads so prolifically that it will girdle and kill the trees. It will form a ground cover where nothing else can grow, and the berries are toxic to humans and pets. Giant reed, Arundo donax. This is, again, another introduced grass. It was introduced for erosion control and ended up being the plant that channelizes our rivers and causes huge difficulties in our riparian habitats. This is how tall it is if you've never been right next to it. And of course, you've seen this picture before. This is a monoculture along the Rio Grande. We know that these massive roots cause bank erosion and damage to structures and bridges. It can grow as much as 10 inches a day. It crowds out native plants and can resprout. If a piece of that plant is washed downstream and buried in 9 feet of mud, it can still grow. So we're talking about very, very persistent roots and root fragments. Consumes 12 times as much water as our native plants, alters the water flow, can create intense fires, and the fragments move downstream. The only project that I've seen that was successful in eradicating Arundo was on the Nueces River. And the late Sky Lewin managed to get all the landowners from the beginning to the basically, from the headwaters to work together to eradicate Arundo. And she was successful. But we have our challenges on other rivers in Texas. Let's talk about the golden rain tree. Anybody know this tree? I don't, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't have the seed pods on this one. They look like little Chinese lanterns. We know that it's brittle wood. It's a fast-growing tree, prolific seed production, germinates quickly, and the seeds are easily dispersed. Typically, I find these in riparian habitats. By the way, most of these plants, when I do I do a morning walk, it's usually pre-dawn to get these plant samples, and I can always find them in the riparian areas. They all hang out together. Elephant ears. How many of you have seen elephant ears in this area? So this, it's taro. They grow it as a crop in Southeast Asia, but it doesn't belong here, and it takes over, outcompetes all the native riparian plants and becomes a monoculture like so many others. Again, during flood events, little fragments of this can float downstream to form new infestations, and it reproduces extremely easily. Also, the liquid or oils from the leaves, stem, or roots can cause skin irritation, itching, and eye damage. By the way, with all of these plants, if you get involved with eradication, wear your gloves, wear your eye protection, wear long sleeves and long pants. Don't forget your snake guards, because these plants are basically, a lot of them release chemicals that are irritating to humans. Again, they're poisonous to sheep, goats, chickens, humans, and pets, and they change the riparian habitat. Paper mulberry, we've got a wonderful sample here of that. We do have a good mulberry. The red mulberry is a fantastic tree in our environment. The white mulberry is invasive and the paper mulberry invasive. One of the problems is that they hybridize. So now we have an invasive plant that's hybridizing with our natives. So if you see a mulberry, pay attention, and if it's paper, get it out. or if it's white, get it out. The trees blow over easily. It forms shallow thickets, aggressive, hybridizes, and transmits diseases to our native mulberries. Tree of Heaven. How many of you read the book, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn? That was Tree of Heaven, that tree that came up through the sidewalk. Tree of Heaven is a very persistent tree. Another one that has chemicals released into the soil. The sap can actually cause heart problems. So if you have a Tree of Heaven, make sure again that you are either assisted by a trained arborist or tree specialist, or you know what you're doing, because we don't want you to have a heart attack cutting down that tree. Yes, ma'am. So what I just heard is that one of the participants here today has a neighbor with a Tree of Heaven, and she found one that was sprouting in her yard 200 feet away. So these are prolific seed producers, and they will show up if there's a Tree of Heaven anywhere in your vicinity. They produce seeds by 2- and 3-year-old plants, and 66 to 78% of the seeds germinate. Here's a number for you: 52 million seeds during its 100-year lifetime. KR Bluestem, anybody? We're not even going to talk about KR. We know that throughout the state of Texas, it's a problem, it's a challenge. There are all kinds of fantastic researchers, graduate students at every university in Texas, studying fire regimens, studying herbicide, studying weedy plants over the KR. And, we haven't found any solutions yet, but we've got to try. Because the KR bluestem, along with all the other exotic invasive grasses, are changing the Texas habitat. It's crowding out the bluebonnets. It's crowding out the Indian blankets. All the wildflowers that we've come to love that really define who we are as Texans, they're all hiding under a sea of exotic grasses. Extensive root systems reduce the diversity, of course, and a lot of the ranchers who originally had quail on every acre, the quail is gone. It grows in dense turf mats that allow very little light to reach, and again, it's one of those grasses that can contribute to catastrophic fires. Here's a dilemma. 80% of the seed that is sold in South Texas is buffalo grass. Buffalo grass is also the most problematic grass in West Texas. So we're selling it on the one hand, we're eradicating it on the other hand. The same things happens in the nursery, and I hope that nobody is directly involved with the Texas Superstar program, but I have to tell you that every year they list 3 or 4 invasives as their superstars. And way back in 2007, when I was very naive, I went up to one of the gentlemen who promotes this program, and I said, "Why are you promoting invasive plants as Texas superstars?" He said, "Our job is to find plants that won't have competitors, that basically will grow under every circumstance." I said, "Well, that's counter to what I believe." Anyway, we still have Milberger's Nursery and many, many, many other nurseries selling invasive plants. Okay, what can we do? This is the most important part of this program. We can lead by example. When I started to dig up my St. Augustine grass back in 1998, my neighbor drove by and said, "What the hell are you doing?" And you know what? My entire front yard and most of my backyard is a native habitat. But I will also tell you that when I took the citizen scientist program back in 2007, I came home and I had 7 species of invasive plants in my yard that I didn't know were there because I didn't know what they were. So step 1 is to find out what you've got. Step 2 is to cut them down or get rid of them. And step 3 is to replace them and restore the habitat that is conducive to all the Texas, everything that we want in Texas. Let's talk about eradication strategies. Most of these are geared to people like you and me who have small properties. If you have large properties, we're talking about airplanes, large mechanical devices, We're talking about bulldozers, but in your backyard, you can hand pull and bag. Don't just hand pull and throw it on the ground, because those seeds or parts of the plant will reproduce. We can mulch them. Again, not the mulch that you put on your walkway, but the mulch that makes it small enough that you can put it in your landscape bin and have it hauled away. Having trouble with this. Pruning and lopping, with or without herbicide. If you want to keep pruning that or lopping that tree over and over and over again, that's fine. If you want it to die right now, then you need to add herbicide to it. Cut stem with herbicide. That's what we do with Nandina and with Vitex and with a lot of these trees. We cut the stem to the lowest possible place. We paint the outside or we spray the outside with the appropriate herbicide, the appropriate amount, the appropriate concentration, and then we retreat if necessary. Girdling with herbicide. Let's look at some of these photos. And then basal bark spray with herbicide. So here we go, manual hand pulling. To the left, we've got some grasses. To the right, we have bastard cabbage. Anybody seen that before? Manual pulling with a weed wrench. It's a very powerful tool. It's like a giant lever. It helps someone even my size pull out a big ligustrum sapling. And that's great fun. Having trouble with, okay. Don't forget your assisted devices. We're going to be doing this for a long time, folks. So let's make sure that we're not doing back-breaking work. We use lots of manual tools, mechanical tools. Buy good tools, folks. Don't buy the cheap stuff because it breaks, it doesn't cut, it gets frustrating. It's not worth it. Make the investment. If you can only afford $50, then buy yourself a good pair of loppers or a good pair of pruners. Don't buy cheap tools because you'll work 3 times as hard to get the job done. This is an example of our Salsa Squad eradicating giant reed in the Helotes Creek. We mulched, we hauled the plants up to the top of the hill, we mulched them, and then they took the mulch and they burned it. We also did elephant ears at the same time. This is an example of cutting and spraying Nandina. Again, we cut the stem. Manual tools for girdling. You can use a hatchet. You can use a particular girdling tool. If you cut into the cambium layer of the tree, and we've done this with trees that are 3, 4, 5 feet in diameter, if you cut deeply enough, it cuts off the lifeblood of the tree. And you better believe that when I'm girdling a Chinaberry tree, girdling a Chinese tallow, it's very satisfying because remember, I'm cutting down on the future supply of seeds. Here's girdling a Chinaberry tree. My friend Lonnie to the left, me to the right. Basal bark spraying. That's only for in supervised situations because, again, you have to have the right concentration and you have to have a lot of money because when you're basal bark spraying, you're basically coating the entire, basically a foot to 18 inches of the bark around the tree. Okay, remember the 3 things that we're concerned about. That invasive species can cause economic or environmental damage or harm human health. How can we help? You're all here because you're Native Plant Society folks, you're master naturalists, you're gardeners. Yes, ma'am. Oh, very good. Okay, we can choose native plants. We know that native plants equal healthy habitats. We know that native plants use less water. That's pretty darn critical. We know that they require less maintenance after you've gotten them established. They require less maintenance. They can survive weather extremes, the kinds of droughts we have, the kinds of flood we have. How many of you lost native plants during the big freeze? Okay. How many of you discovered that all of your native plants survived during the big freeze? Okay. All of my plants survived. Even my Barbados cherry, which I thought was dead, came back. So basically these plants they can manage these extremes of temperature, these extremes of precipitation. Typically, they don't require pesticides. They provide food. Remember we said it's about the food, folks. Nectar, pollen, seeds, berries, and food for larvae. Native plants attract a greater variety of insects. And I have to tell you, until I read Doug Ptolemy's books, bringing nature home and nature in your backyard, I never really appreciated the insects the way I needed to. But if you have plants that insects are attracted to, then it goes straight up the food chain. And if you don't have plants that insects can eat, it's a dead end. You don't have the food for the wildlife. Oak trees, according to Doug Ptolemy, support 534 species of Lepidoptera in North America. And remember, China berry trees are toxic to insects. Why are insects important? They're primary food source, they're pollinators. Most insect herbivores can only eat those plants that they co-evolved with. So that tree that comes from China, again, it may as well be a plastic plant because those insects don't recognize it, can't eat it, or if they do, they die. A habitat without insects is a habitat without most forms of higher life. We also know that 96% of the birds that are feeding their young require insects, even the hummingbirds. What plants do you have in your yard? Are they native? Are they non-native but not invasive? Or are they invasive? How can you help? Lead by example. Purchase native plants. Share your knowledge with your neighbors and your neighborhood associations. A lot of people struggle with neighborhood associations because they have certain requirements about a certain percentage of turf or certain plants. If they start to look weedy, then they get citations. But keep at it. Keep working at it. We are changing the way we look at our lawns. This is the Salsa Squad. This is our group. How many of you have heard of the Salsa Squad? Okay, we wear bright orange t-shirts so we don't get lost in the woods. We also, the story was that we were eradicating China berry trees down at Medina River Natural Area. We had a whole group of about 14 of us. We came around a corner and there was an entire, almost an acre of chili patin plants. And one of our members said, there's enough chili in here to make salsa for the whole squad. So that's how we got our name. And now we're called the Salsa Squad. And our goal is to help spread the word, stop the spread. It will be the plants that we use in our gardens that determine what nature will look like 50 years from now. I have a little grandson, he's 3 years old. I want him to know the oaks and the mulberries. I want him to know the yopons. I want him to know the elbow bush. I don't want him to grow up with ligustrum and chinaberry and tallow and KR. If you plant it, they will come. We replaced some kind of invasive, I don't even know what it was, maybe monkey grass with Virginia creeper. And sure enough, one day I went out my door and there it was, an 8-spotted forester moth. Blue mistflower, queen butterfly. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Famous last words, but it's not invasive in my yard. Thank you very much. I'll take questions. Oh, yeah. After questions, I just want to point out, if some of you have not yet seen this little native plant book produced by the Austin Watershed Department, we do have some for sale. They're $2. This is the plant book that I always go to first because I carry it with me in my backpack. It has lots of pictures and descriptions about the best conditions for these plants. Questions? Yes, way at the back. If you speak loud, I'll repeat your question. Yes, ma'am.
How's this figure compiled? Because I know they're not paying your salary, Cheryl. Number two, you're well aware that the Native Plant Society is working on a database of invasive plants and suggested replacements, native replacements for them.
Yes.
For example, chinaberry. One of the problems you say of chinaberry is that it is toxic. A native replacement often suggested is western soapberry, which has toxic berries. Yes. You know, how do you explain that?
So there are a couple of questions.
There are other plants, the other native plants that are toxic as well. So
yes, so there are two parts of the question. First of all, how do we calculate the economic cost? And I would say that it's probably a gross underestimate of what it actually costs. Because every place I go in Texas, I'm meeting with park people, I'm meeting with federal officials, fish and wildlife officials. Every single organization in the state of Texas is working on invasive plants. And I think that we probably are, I think we're probably spending $1 trillion a year on invasive plants, but we don't have a very good way of measuring that. So I guess the answer is it's basically just based on firsthand experience. I think that it's something that everybody is challenged by. Second part is, yes, the NPSOT group is working very hard, region by region, to ask the local chapters to list alternative plants to the invasives. And yes, we know that if you can get sick from eating a yopon berry. We know that Virginia creeper has a toxic berry. But the fact is that our wildlife has adapted to that in ways that they have not adapted to ligustrum berries or nandina. And it's our job as parents and grandparents and educators to convey that information about the native alternatives that may also have some toxic attributes. I don't think anybody here would feed a poinsettia plant to their dog or their child, because everybody knows it's toxic. So part of it is communication, education, but I would still much prefer to have that native alternative, because the insects have co-evolved, the animals have co-evolved to eat those plants. I hope that answers those questions. Other questions? Bless you. Yes.
To use the appropriate herbicide. But if you want to let UGRA know, they're compiling a list. I think right now TPW is not spraying, but they're going to resume it. And if you want your property treated, they can get you in the queue for it.
So basically what she shared is that Texas Parks and Wildlife is working in partnership with UG, okay, which means that if you have a problem with the Rhododendron in your situation, to please notify them, and you can perhaps get some funding support for that. Increasingly, I'm finding multiple organizations working in partnership, because we can't do it alone. It has to be a combination of paid employees and federal employees, state employees, local employees, and volunteers, which is what we basically did in Bernie. We had several volunteers. We also had city help to get that ligustrum under control.
But we get people on the list to get treated by the TPW trained applicators.
Very good. Okay, so the clarification is that you're on the list, and then the applicators will come. This is a complex issue, and there are no easy answers. And there are times when I feel discouraged, but then when I come to groups like this, or when I go to Bernie, or I go to Bandera, or I meet my Salsa Squad every Tuesday morning, you know what? If we cut down one tree that day and it's a mother tree, we're cutting down on the future supply. If we dig up a little stand of bamboo, even though there may be another mile of it, we've made a difference to that ecosystem, to that soil, to those animals, to those insects. And you know, when I first came to Texas back in 1986, somebody said, the thing I like about Texans is they try. And that's one of the things that I've really taken to heart. When you look at this transformation of habitat, transformation of landscapes, substitution of invasives with natives, we're trying the best we can. And I appreciate everything that everybody does on behalf of nature. Thank you very much.